Welcome, everybody. We're just wandering in from the waiting room right now and having people show up. So we'll get started here in a minute or two. All right. Well, thank you all for dropping by on this Wednesday. It's nice to see some familiar names and faces and a couple new ones. This is great. As more people trickle in, we're going to go ahead and get started today. This fine April afternoon or evening for our guest speaker will have us talking about a good talk that I think some practitioners and actually anybody who's wandered into a museum will have some thoughts about. So our guest today is Dylan Thompson, formerly at Macquarie University. He's now at Erasmus in Rotterdam. And he is going to be presenting on some early stage work. I know he's put in a lot of work on this over the past year or two, but this piece that he's going to be presenting on is still early stages. So I think we'll have a great conversation, and you all can help contribute to all of this by posting questions in the chat or just waiting till the second half and raising your hand, and we can have a great conversation. So Dylan is a great emerging scholar in the field of cultural economics and policy, and I'm excited that I've been able to work with him and can personally attest to how exciting all of his current and future work will be. So with no other introductions than that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Dylan to get us started.
Well, thanks a lot, Doug. Thank you for the glowing welcome. And thank you to everyone for joining for the seminar today. I'll just share my screen. Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting on a some joint work between me, Doug, and Joanna, which I have clumsily got titled at the moment, Contributed Efficiency. It's an analysis of some determinants of the efficiency or the technical efficiency of US-based art museums. And as Doug kindly alluded to, this is very much a work in progress. We started this work nearly 2 years or a year and a half ago now as a commission project for some non-academic clients, and we're trying to turn some of the work into an academic paper now. But as you'll probably see over the course of the presentation, there's been some difficulties we've had to overcome, and so this is sort of what we've got for the present moment. I also started the new job at Erasmus nearly 6 months ago now, and it's been quite a busy start, so I haven't had as much time to focus on doing this work and preparing for these presentations as I might otherwise have liked. But nevertheless, let's see if we can get some useful discussion. If you've got any tips or important points you think that we might have missed out on in the presentation or in the final paper, please let me know. Please feel free to put that in the chat, and hopefully we can discuss it at the end of the presentation. So to give a bit of context, this work is based on some work we did for Museum as part of IO Research, which was the nonprofit that Doug and Joanna set up to do non-academic consulting research. They brought me on board to help out mainly with the data side of things, particularly for the project with Museum. So Museum was attempting to do an analysis of the US art museum sector with a focus on influencing US art museums to be more mission focused. So their blurb on LinkedIn says they're an independent research project seeking to promote the mission-based innovation amongst art museums in the US. And you may have seen some of their work in the press recently. So they've been releasing consistent reports or data briefs looking at how museums could benefit from offering free admission, why museums should try and be more transparent. And all of the reports or the work that they've been releasing over the last year or so is all coming from that work that Doug, Joanna, and I did for them in building this database. So the main project we had for, or that Bree Museum brought us along board for, was to rank the effectiveness of US-based art museums in using their resources to achieve their public-facing goals, or the goals that they outlined in their mission statements. We also, as part of this overarching project, we highlighted how many museums were focusing on the public in their museum statements. The figures are escaping me now, but it's something like 70% of museums said that they were publicly focused. They focused on educating or engaging the public in some way. But we also highlighted the lack of accessible and consistent data reported by these museums across the US, which sort of hinders the ability of academics and others from being able to evaluate the extent to which museums are living up to their mission. So that's formed the basis of the data collection efforts that was used by Uri Museum in these reports. Today, however, we're going to use this data to answer some questions that we think are more interesting from an academic perspective. But I'll go into the data collection in a little bit just to give some insight into what we had to do for Uri Museum and how we the lengths we had to go through to bring this together, and some of the challenges that has brought about for the current project as well. So the questions we're looking to answer are mainly associated with the use of particularly financial resources by museums and how this affects their ability to meet their missions or to achieve their multifaceted goals. So we all know, or at least economists would say, that public support for museums is generally justified by their quasi-public good nature and the externalities that flow from the consumption of museum-related services. So there's various arguments behind why museums deserve or should receive public support that can fall into one of those two categories. But as a result of this, museums worldwide receive lots of, but typically various amounts of public funding. And as a result, they typically face pressure to demonstrate effective use and accountability for the use of taxpayer resources. Now, in recent years, or at least over the past 20 years, this funding has become increasingly under pressure, but particularly after COVID, the funding has been increasingly felt, or the pressure has been increasingly felt by museums worldwide. And over the period between 2008 and 2019, approximately 42% of museums surveyed by, I'm now blanking on the acronym there, but it's a Research Association for the Public Funding of Museums. They found that 42% of museums stated that their budget decreased between 2008 and 2019 as a result of public funding decreases. As a result, museums are typically now relying on hybrid funding models or a blend of funding sources to fulfill their missions. That's not so new for those who are aware of the museum funding environment for the US, but particularly in places like Europe and other parts of the world, museums are increasingly being forced to or pressured to rely on hybrid or alternative sources of funding and rely less on private funding. And yeah, there's some substantial heterogeneity in this across the world, but also within countries. So within any given country, there's particular large difference in the amount of funding that some museums are receiving compared to others. So as a result of this, museums are facing a variety of pressures related to the funding that they can attract and how this enables them to achieve their missions. Now, we think that museums, their ability to secure and attract different funding sources also has the potential to influence their operational efficiency. On the one hand, the structure of funding arrangements might help to make museums more efficient or use their funding more efficiently. So on one hand, the museum funding relationship forms or is akin to a principal-agent relationship, where the funder can stipulate conditions that align the incentives of the agent with the principal, and therefore potentially help museums fulfill their missions better if the principal's incentives of what the principal wants is for the mission to be fulfilled. On the other hand, this might excessively constrain museum management. It might mean that they are inflexible to respond to shocks. And similarly, any reliance on a single source of funding may be particularly risky for museums. And so diversification has been argued to be a source of de-risking for museums, particularly if they have excessive covenants or constraints on their ability to react to changing circumstances. So therefore, we think museum performance likely depends in some way on the diversification of funding sources, and the ability to attract funding sources or alternative sources of funding, particularly when public funding is drying up, may in fact be related to better outcomes for museums, which is potentially a counterintuitive approach, at least for some in maybe perhaps the European museum context. So in light of this, we seek to answer two questions. First, to what extent are typical museum funding sources related to the efficient use of resources in museums? And to what extent is a reliance on a particular funding source associated with better or worse performance? So answering those questions is particularly challenging in the museum context because of the difficult to quantify nature of museum operations and their objectives. So typically museums lack a clear performance metric. They don't have a single metric from which to measure how they have performed year to year, like profit would, or profit derivatives would form for non-profit organizations and public companies. And they typically provide multiple services and seek to achieve multiple potentially conflicting objectives, which make it difficult to necessarily measure the trade-offs between the achievement of those objectives and to rank or to evaluate the performance of any particular museum. One approach that has been offered as a solution by scholars, particularly in economics, is the data envelopment analysis approach, or DEA, which is a non-parametric approach used to assess efficiency as a performance measure, and is well equipped to handle multi-input, multi-output situations in which museums typically thought to be in that basket. And it's also been widely applied in the literature. So we decided to follow the same approach to measure museum performance using a DEA. And this is also the approach that was taken to provide a ranking of museums for the Re-Museum project. So a lot of this paper is, a lot of this work is derived directly from the Re-Museum project, in that we collected data to generate a data analysis, and we are trying to use DEA now to answer some different questions. So a number of studies have applied DEA to study museums and museum performance. The earliest strands on this literature have focused on using DEA in and of itself to measure performance and then provide specific guidance for museum managers. So one way that DEA can be used is to identify the particular inputs or outputs that are being used too much in the case of inputs, or the outputs that are being produced too much, and give concrete guidance to particular managers about which inputs they should reduce or which outputs they should increase. Other studies have focused, however, on the systematic or environmental determinants of efficiency. So looking at the sorts of variables that systematically cause some museums to be more or less efficient than others. Scholars have found factors such as government structure, the type of collection, their physical and historical settings, and various socioeconomic factors to influence museum efficiency and performance. Some others have also found space and accessibility measures and the use of information and communication technologies to be particularly influential on museum performance as well. So far, most of the studies have been performed on museums based in Europe. And so the question about how different sources of funding influence museum efficiency has been relatively less studied, given that the variation in museum funding in Europe is quite low typically. It's a fairly broad and generalized statement, but we think that at least that the US context, we see much more heterogeneity and diversity in the reliance on particular funding sources than in Europe. An alternative literature that doesn't use DEA focuses on the role of funding structures in determining museum outcomes. So some scholars have found that commercial incomes might have negative impacts on museum operations. Public funding can support social objectives or the achievement of social objectives, but may inhibit innovation, which will potentially impact long-term efficiency. And private ownership and financial autonomy have been found to be related to better effectiveness of the dissemination of culture generally, so better visitor engagement and better public accessibility. That was the European study, but they did not use DEA in their approach. We also know that donor governance, in particular restrictions on the use of donor funds, is related to performance in an ambivalent way. So Yermak, in an important paper in 2017, showed that restrictions on donor funds can improve the alignment of museums with their mission by reducing the ability of managers to appropriate funds. Effectively, Yermak showed that donor-related restrictions was related to greater spending on program-related activities. But he also showed that managerial flexibility was potentially limited by donor-related restrictions. And so in situations of crises or upheaval, this may limit the ability of museums to respond and therefore have a negative impact on their efficiency. So the ultimate takeaway was that whether or not donor restrictions improved efficiency or not was unclear. So we seek to try and speak to Yermak's results to some extent here, but more broadly, we try and merge these two literatures. So we merge the use of DEA to evaluate museum performance with the literature focusing on how funding structures affect museum operations. So how do we do this? I'll now cover the data collection efforts that we went through for the Re-Museum project. So we collected this data as part of IO Research Inc.'s work for Re-Museum, which was a fairly extensive process. So Doug and Joanna brought me on board in October 2023, I believe, and this wasn't finished. Well, arguably this still isn't finished, but we didn't finish this for Re-Museum until about October last year. And effectively, we spent quite some time combining data from museum annual reports, museum websites, other websites, IRS 990 tax filings across multiple years to provide the most comprehensive snapshot of museum operations in one space that we believe exists at present. This is what Re-Museum has been using to produce those related reports. The sample of museums that we chose to study was the museums that are members of the Association of Art Museum Directors. So as of April 2024, there were 199 museums that were a part of this association. And we've used these as our starting sample. We're taking this as a sample of the population of museums or art museums in the US. and we started from that. We decided to try and collect as much data as we could on as many museums as we could. We first started by identifying museums that actually reported tax info independently to the IRS, which was going to be an important consideration, given that most of the main source of data that we're going to rely on was this tax filing information, and quite a few museums don't report that information independently. They report it as consolidated with broader or umbrella organizations. Once we had identified those museums, we collected as much of the IRS 990 tax data as we could. So we programmatically did that. We collected everything that the National Center for Charitable Statistics has for the 133 museums with IRS 990 tax data. For those museums, we then went and started collecting the remaining data from publicly accessible documents, such as annual reports and impact statements, to get information on visitor numbers, for example. And we did this for multiple years. We went back to 2018 as the earliest year. So we have visitor numbers for some museums for that 6-year period from 2018 to 2023. And then finally, we collected some other data from the American Community Survey, TripAdvisor, et cetera, to get some ideas or some measures of market-related variables that might impact museum efficiency as well. So the final analytical sample we have for this project consists of 72 unique museums with some level of complete data. So these are 72 museums that report data for at least 1 year and have data for all of the variables that we're interested in. And then we collect the data for some of those museums across the years 2018 to 2023. The basic idea here is that there's some museums that have repeat data for all of those years and for all the variables that we're interested in, others only for 1 or 2 years. So it's a fairly patchy data set, but this is the best that we've been able to pull together on museum operations so far. This forms a total of 227 museum year observations. Again, there's some museums with multiple years, some with only 1 or 2. So we end up with an unbalanced panel of museums. Now, rather than use the panel and exploit the panel nature of the data for the econometric phase of the study, we have so far decided to consider each museum year pair as a separate decision-making unit. So decision-making unit is DEA terminology for a unit of observation. And we've done this so we collapsed the time dimension of our panel and effectively assumed that every museum in a different year is a different museum. There's a bunch of reasons we've done this. One is to just try and get a bigger sample of data. That's really the main reason for doing this, to increase the statistical power for our econometrics. But we can justify this because the use of DEA is DEA is better for use in an environment where you're studying relatively homogeneous units, decision-making units. And so by keeping all the museums in there across different time periods, but assuming that they are different museums in each time period, we're effectively imposing homogeneity on the sample, because a particular museum in 2023 will be relatively similar to its outcomes in 2022. This is also an approach that previous studies have used. So we're going to rely on some literature to justify this as well. And given some concerns about serial correlation amongst the residuals that might pop up, we'll follow the Samara-Wilson approach of bootstrapping the standard error estimates to hopefully rid any estimates of serial correlation. So from a statistical perspective, we have hopefully dealt with those limitations. So we collected for this study data for inputs and outputs for the DEA, which are outlined in this first panel. So our inputs are the space of a museum's gallery in square feet. We also have the asset value of land, buildings, and equipment from the IRS 990 tax data, and a measure of the number of employees in a museum for a given year. These are the inputs into our DEA. I'll explain that a little bit more in a bit. And then our only output at present is the total number of yearly visitors. So these variables are used to construct our efficiency measure. We then use the following variables in panel 2 as our explanatory variables. So we're looking at different levels of financing or different financing sources, private contributions, which is a combination of fundraising income from fundraising events, and other contributions is measured in IRS 990 tax filing forms, which is effectively any form of contribution that is not a government grant or other specific forms of contributions that are not privately donated. We also measure government grants, program revenue, investment income, so income from the capital gain from selling investment goods or from dividends, etc. And then measures of miscellaneous income, which effectively just anything else that it doesn't fall into one of these categories that adds up to total revenue. So this typically is constituted of sales from gift shops, etc. We also measure museum age from the IRS data, and then we get measures of the population of the metropolitan statistical area that the museum resides in, and the per capita income of the metropolitan statistical area as well. And then finally, we get measures of what we're using as proxies for complements and substitutes at the market level. So we have the number of sites and landmarks that are reported in a city according to TripAdvisor. So this is a measure of complement activities in a particular market. Perhaps the hypothesis broadly here is that the more sites and landmarks there are in a city, the less a museum has to do necessarily to attract visitors, and perhaps this will be negatively related to efficiency. Likewise, art museums is the count of art museums in a particular city that a museum resides in. So this is a measure of substitutes or competition, and a simple hypothesis here that more other art museums in a given city will make museums be more efficient, have to do more to try to attract visitors. So we're going to use all of these variables in our second stage regression to explain the efficiency of US-based art museums. In the third panel, I'm just breaking down the funding sources shown in the second panel in terms of their proportion of total revenue, to give you some idea of the degree of reliance on particular revenue sources and the variation reliance on particular revenue sources across our sample of museums. So on average, museums rely on private contributions for 45% of their funding, government grants for 12%, program revenue for 10%, investment income for 20%, and miscellaneous income for about 4%. But there's quite substantial heterogeneity in those means, quite a lot of variation across the sample. So if we plot the distribution of the proportion of total revenue from different funding sources, we can see that on the one hand, some funding sources such as miscellaneous revenue and program revenue, and to a lesser extent government grants, there's relatively little variation in the amount that museums rely on those funding sources. So most museums don't rely on miscellaneous revenue to fund their operations at all. Some greater variation for program revenue and for government grants. Just a quick note: these outliers are because we get these negative values for investment and miscellaneous income. So this is negative returns from selling stocks and negative returns from selling inventory. So I need to fix this up still, but just ignore those outliers for now. On the other hand, we have relatively large variation in the degree of reliance on financial income and private contributions. And this one, I think, is the most important, in that we have some museums that are relying on private contributions for practically none of the funding for their operations, and some that rely on private contributions for all of the funding, funding all of their operations. And there's quite a large degree of variation here. So there's potential for there to be a relationship between the degree of reliance on private contributions and museum efficiency. Are those that rely more heavily on private contributions more or less efficient than others? So to measure efficiency, we're going to use DEA, which I've already introduced, but it's a non-parametric method to evaluate the efficiency of decision-making units with multiple inputs and outputs, widely used in settings where organizations don't make a profit. It measures technical efficiency, so how well a museum transforms its resources into important outcomes. And in this context, an efficient museum will be the one that is best transforming its space, capital, and equipment and employees into producing the greatest number of visitors. So the DA approach uses effectively a linear programming method to construct a efficiency frontier by finding the museums that are the best performers, that are performing the best in terms of transforming these variables into visitors. And then it analyzes how far away other DMUs, other museums are from that best frontier to form a measure of inefficiency. And the scores that we get, the variable that measures efficiency or inefficiency, gives us a measure of how far away decision-making units are from the best possible frontier as constructed by DEA. In an input-oriented DEA model, which is we believe is right for this context, the DEA measures how much a museum can reduce its inputs while still producing the same output. So we think this makes sense because in the museum context, museums can't choose the number of outputs it produces. At least in our simple studies, the museum managers are not choosing how many visitors are going to visit the museum every day, but they are choosing the number of employees or the amount of exhibition space to be used to entice visitors to the museum. So with an input-oriented DEA model, we can effectively show the formulation of the DEA as follows. So theta is a measure of efficiency, and it's calculated in a very general sense as the weighted sum of outputs generated by the museum, where the weights are chosen by the DEA approach as part of its optimization procedure, divided by the weighted sum of inputs used by the museum. And so when theta equals 1, the intuition is that the museum is not able to reduce its inputs by any amount to produce the same amount of output, and therefore it is an efficient museum. When theta is less than 1, it's using excess inputs to produce that level of output. The DEA procedure has decided that, or has made the decision that it can reduce some input and still produce the same amount of output. So this is what is called, or what the DEA identifies as an inefficient museum. So we're going to get efficiency scores from the DEA approach, identifying whether museums are efficient or not. The scores are bounded between 0 and 1, so we get some proportions measuring, this, roughly measuring this proportion. To investigate how different variables affect efficiency, we're going to basically just regress those variables from the table I showed you earlier on efficiency scores to try and see if there's any systematic relationships between efficiency or inefficiency and any of the explanatory variables of interest. Now, a simple regression like this, potentially can work. However, some scholars have identified that such naive regressions are problematic. This is because DEA scores are severely correlated because they're not drawn independently from some population. They are constructed based on a sample. So they're by definition severely correlated. And also the bounded nature of DEA scores, because it's bounded between 1 and 0 at the lower end, means that standard regression approaches will be biased. And so a variety of approaches have been proposed in the literature. We're going to follow the approach proposed by Samara and Wilson. We're going to estimate a truncated regression of the DEA scores and use 1,000 bootstraps to account for serial correlation residuals. So the truncated regressions deals with the bounded nature of the DEA scores, and the bootstrap deals with the serial correlated nature of the residuals. Formally, we'll be estimating the following regression. We'll be taking the log of the DEA efficiency scores for museum year I, or DMUI, regress it on a constant, and then the sum of the log of revenue sources. So this is every revenue source shown in that table: program, revenue, private contributions, government grants, etc. These are the variables that we are most interested in. So that's why I'm showing them collectively, but separately there. And then we're also going to include the rest of variables as controls to try and account for other determinants of, or other potential determinants of museum efficiency that have been highlighted in the literature, to try and see if we can tease out any potential causal relationships, or tease out the association between efficiency and these variables a little better. And we'll also include some year dummies to try and capture sector-wide shocks to museum efficiency, such as the COVID-19 shock. Okay, so now onto the results. So there's a lot to get through here. I'm just going to present the results in full because I haven't had time to slim it down at all, but I'll point out the most important ones. So we're starting off with the full sample of museums. This is the 227 museum year observations from across the 2018 to 2023 period. The main results of that, all we find is that program revenue and miscellaneous revenue is negatively associated with museum efficiency. We also find that for the year dummies 2021 and 2020, they are negatively associated with museum efficiency, which implies that COVID was bad for museum efficiency, which isn't a particularly insightful finding, but I guess it gives some validity to our approach. If we saw something else here, it might suggest that there was something wrong. So I guess this is a bit of a robustness check as well. We also find that the size of a metropolitan statistical area population is negatively associated with efficiency, and that the number of art museums in the same city is also negatively associated with efficiency, which goes against what we hypothesized earlier. Now, some concerns with that approach, that on one hand, the homogeneity of the sample may not be sufficient, because we still have some museums in that sample that report data for only 1 or 2 years, and therefore are systematically different from museums that report data for, say, 5 to 6 years. On the other hand, there are significant impacts of COVID-19 and other macroeconomic shocks, the start of the inflation in 2021 and 2022, for example, that are unlikely to be adequately accounted for by including year dummies, particularly because the effects of COVID-19 were not felt uniformly across the US, but varied based on state policies, for example. So to try and get at these limitations, try and improve on these limitations, we simply repeat the process, but on a reduced sample of museums. So in the first reduced sample, we're going to only use museums that report data for at least 5 years. So they're either reporting from 2019 to 2023, 2018 to 2022, or 2018 to 2023. We call this the consistent sample. And then we'll also repeat the process for a reduced sample of museums for which we have data for only 2022 and 2023 to try and remove the effects of particularly COVID. Neither of these are a perfect approach, but given the size of the sample we have, these are just sort of simple robustness checks to try and see how robust our estimates are to changes in the sample. So with our consistent reporting sample, we get quite different results. The first particular result we get is that we now see that private contributions are consistently and positively statistically related to museum efficiency. So across various specifications, the amount of private contributions that a museum receives is positively related to efficient use of resources. We still see program revenue and miscellaneous revenue negatively associated with museum efficiency. So that is a consistent finding from the last specification. We also see 2021 as a systematically inefficient year. And then we get some other results as well. So older museums now found to be systematically inefficient, and population and income are also related to efficiency in some way. Our number of art museum relationship drops out. That's for the consistent sample. For the 2022 and 2023 sample, we've only got 99 observations here, so it's a very small sample and an underpowered regression. So it's unlikely we're going to see highly statistically significant estimates here, but we still see some evidence of statistical significance and a positive relationship between private contributions and efficiency. And again, we still see some relationship with age. So even though the sample is quite small, there's still some tentative evidence that private contributions are positively related to efficiency and museum age. So, as a summary of the findings, we've shown that private contributions, or museums that attract private contributions, tend to be more efficient. There's no systematic relationship between government funding and efficiency, or government grant funding, to be exact. There's an inconsistent relationship between investment income and efficiency. And finally, there's a generally negative relationship between program revenue, miscellaneous revenue, and efficiency. Now, on one hand, this might mean that museums that rely more on program revenue and miscellaneous revenue might be more efficient. They might be less able to fulfill their missions. A potential alternative explanation for this is that we're just not measuring the things that are part of museums' missions that program revenue and miscellaneous revenue are correlated with. So we're only measuring visitors. Program revenue, for example, is potentially or likely correlated with educational programs or other parts of the museum mission that aren't necessarily measured by visitors. So it's possible that this finding is just problematic because we're not measuring important parts of the museum mission. And so measuring some of these other services would be important to improving our understanding of the efficiency of museums. And some other findings, we find that older museums tend to be less efficient. Some market-wide factors are not typically predictive of efficiency, so we found very limited evidence of any of the other control variables being related to efficiency, but we find strong evidence that aggregate demand shocks such as COVID-19 were important. So what are the implications of this research? Well, one might say that funding matters for museum performance. On one hand, philanthropic funding may enable more efficient resource use, although alternatively, it's possible that excessive reliance on program and miscellaneous revenue may be related to poor performance. Those are causal statements that our research doesn't actually provide validation for, but that is a potential outcome from our research. We also show that older museums tend to be less efficient, and so perhaps older museums need to consider strategies to improve their resource allocation to some extent. Perhaps this is related to the preservation of greater size collections by older museums. So an assumption that is that older museums would have larger collections that they built up over time, and perhaps some of this inefficiency is related to the fact that they spend more resources on preserving greater collections. And finally, again, we just provide some additional impacts of additional evidence of the impacts of COVID. For limitations, the main limitation here is that we've got a very messy, incomplete, and in the end, a small sample, which makes it very difficult to draw robust conclusions. So we need some more data, and this, again, serves as a bit of a call to US museums to try and open up their books and let the public, and particularly academics, have a look to try and improve transparency, but also organizational performance. And of course, we've only provided evidence of correlation here. We have not done anything sufficient to establish a causal relationship. And for example, we cannot rule out situations of reverse causality. So our findings for private contribution might suggest that private contributions cause greater efficiency, or alternatively, more efficient museums may just attract greater private contributions. So more research is needed here to try and tease out the particular relationships that we have identified. And finally, the current DEA approach that we have used may not be sufficient to capture the complex nature of the museum production function. So a variety of other DEA approaches have been specified to try and capture these more complex production functions. We are limited by the data that we have as well. So hopefully at one stage, we'll be able to provide a more complex or more appropriate analysis of museum efficiency with a more complex approach. So to sum it up, future research can collect more data on US-based museums in some way. Future research can also engage in more careful testing of the hypotheses that we've established to try and understand the true nature between, for example, private contributions and the efficiency of museum operations. And they can also consider more appropriate measures and specifications for measuring museum efficiency. So part of this is a bit of a call to action for academics and practitioners to try and build the literature studying the effectiveness of museums in the US, trying to broaden an understanding of what determines the efficient use of museum resources and how can museums more effectively serve the public going forward. That's all I've got for the presentation today. So I'm very much looking forward to any questions and insights you all might be able to provide.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Dylan. So I was going to say we'll open up for questions, but I'm just going straight to Michael. Let's see it.
Okay. Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Dylan, for the presentation. This was really interesting, and I know it's a fairly complex field. Of course, one of the big data restrictions you have is that museums don't have a valuation on their collections. 990 data will all say it's worth 0. So that could be a restriction. So I have, I guess, one overarching sort of concern here, and that is your use of the term efficiency. Because I don't think this analysis measures efficiency at all, right? A data envelopment analysis normally, oops, sorry, my camera is wonky here. Normally, you'd say a data envelopment analysis tries to capture, okay, there are different kinds of outputs we want to produce. So you get sort of a production frontier, and you say, what distance are we from the frontier? Now you're working with a single variable. So, okay, we can, put up my camera here. We can do that, right? We can do it with a single variable. And the single variable you've chosen is attendance. But you're doing that realizing that, yeah, there actually are a whole bunch of other goals. We have data on this one. And so we're going to call efficiency the pursuit of this one single output, even though we know that all arts organizations, not just museums, have multiple goals they are trying to pursue. And so that's really all you're measuring is how do these resources translate into number of visitors. But it might well be that you have a museum that says, well, actually, you know, total number of visitors is not our primary concern. Yeah, we want visitors, but we're trying to do a lot of other things as well. We might be putting on some fairly sophisticated exhibitions that are actually not going to draw a lot of people, but are very important in terms of research. They're very important in terms of bringing an unknown artist to light. There's all kinds of things that can be going on. And so to say, well, we're going to choose this one variable and call that the target of efficiency, I just think is really misleading. It doesn't capture what a lot of museums are actually trying to do, right? And so you're correlating a whole bunch of inputs with a single output, and that single output isn't even necessarily the most important one. So I guess it's a question in the sense of, have I missed something here? Because I really did have a problem with this. But thank you.
I completely agree. If you look at, and it sounds like you've looked at the DEA literature before, you'll see with many of the studies that get done on European museums, for example, they have a long list of outputs that are trying to proxy for the various other activities that museums are engaged in, not just trying to attract visitors. When we started collecting data for this, that was the plan. So they've got proxies for research in terms of publication, proxy for educational visits. They collect numbers of exhibitions, etc. That was the plan originally. And unfortunately, it's just the case that we haven't been able to systematically collect data on those sorts of variables yet. Some museums will report in their financial reports that they produced 10 publications in the last year. Some will not write it anywhere. None of the museums from memory actually talked about the number of exhibitions that they put on per year in an annual report or a financial statement. So we were trying to collect that manually from museum websites by just counting. They usually have a past exhibitions library of their website, and we were just counting exhibitions there. As you can probably tell, that is a fairly laborious process, and at present we just haven't been able to collect enough data on those sorts of variables to be able to use it in the study. So I have the exact same reservations about this, but given that the way that we tried to collect data for Museum, this has been, I guess, the least cost approach so far, is to try and see what we can say with that data so far. I still think it's useful to understand how the use of resources determines museums' ability to serve the public in terms of visitation, but perhaps we should think about a different way of framing the paper, so it's not focused on this broad notion of museum efficiency, but perhaps we focus more on visitation if we're not able to capture those other variables.
I think some of this is probably a matter of sort of framing or presentation, that it's not efficiency in a holistic sense, and just owning how narrow it is. And so it's interesting to think that the inefficient museums are just efficient at something else, right? And we don't know what that something else is, but it's interesting to look at the results and say, older museums, in a sense, maybe have more distractions away from visitation only, and over time they've been pursuing other objectives, which we're not measuring or observing directly. But yeah, it's a good point, and it's so good that Nirot also put a question to that effect in the chat. So you're not alone in thinking this, Michael. I'm going to pop over to Attila's question here, and also thank him for the plug to the ACEI Biennial Conference in Rotterdam, which Dylan is personally hosting this summer. No, I'm kidding. But the Association for Cultural Economists is having their biennial meeting in Rotterdam this summer. And it's nice to know that Attila's going to be there, and hopefully many others. But his question really, I'll just pose it super vaguely. What are your thoughts about bringing in some qualitative data and some other more qualitative aspects into any of this?
Given the lack of quantitative data that we've been able to, I shouldn't say the lack, we've got a lot of data, but for the population of museums that we're studying, given how much missing data we have, I think would be quite useful, particularly given the improvements in technologies for analyzing qualitative data. It could be quite useful to start pulling in particularly information from annual reports and impact statements to think about how museums discuss their impact. I'm not a qualitative researcher, however. I'm getting some introduction to it in my new job, but I haven't had any exposure to qualitative research personally, so I'm not quite sure how to approach it. If you have any suggestions, I'd be very happy to consider them.
Great. Any other questions from the gallery, from the workshop? I will say one last thing from my perspective. Thanks for the presentation, Dylan. I'll tell you, when I've talked about this project in other contexts, especially international ones, I find one of the pieces that gets the audience maybe most quietly excited is the lack of transparency and this sort of frustration about needing to get better and more data about what these public museums and institutions are doing, and how it's not exclusive to the US context. You know, these private institutions may be harder to find information about than in other places, but I think in many other places, there's this push to want to have better access and more transparency and more data to know what's going on, so we can better evaluate and celebrate, in some cases, what's going on. But I think the incentives are pretty obvious as to why there's not a lot of transparency, for good or bad. All right, well, I'm going to bring this to a close with two last points. First of all, thank you again to Dylan for presenting these early day work. And I think the initial feedback you got is actually going to be really informative for how to position this going forward. So thank you. And then secondly, before people sign off, I want to remind you that we'll be back here in 2 weeks on April 23rd for our next workshop in the spring series with Clement Gorin from Paris is going to be coming in and talking about economic development through the lens of paintings, which should also be fascinating as well. And we'll keep on the artistic painting theme. So thank you all for attending, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.